From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. On the 10th anniversary of the Apple iPhone, we go inside the secret history of the one device that changed the world. Today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell, Brian Merchant, senior editor of Motherboard, which is Vice's science and technology outlet. He's the founder and editor of Terraform, Vice's online fiction outlet. He's done a full excavation, and I mean literally, of the iPhone, the deepest dive by any journalist or outsider, for that matter. And that new book is The One Device, The Secret History of the iPhone. Welcome from L.A., Brian.
Thanks so much for having me.
And this is kind of the first deep dive, particularly into the supply chain. Just to give folks an overview of the travels you did, your methodology.
I kind of figured that to tell the whole story of the device itself, of the iPhone, which is now, arguably the most successful product, the best-selling product of our time, I decided to take two tracks, essentially. And on one track, I would tell the story of how the device was conceived and developed within Apple as a consumer technology. On the other track, I thought it would be an interesting endeavor to take sort of a more holistic look at the device itself, really sort of break it down to its component parts and even go as far as I could to the elemental level to see what it's made of, and then sort of follow that assembly line from component part. You have things like the Corning Gorilla Glass that makes the screen, and you have multi-touch sensors, and it's all made of stuff. So I, looked at the mines where it comes from. I looked at the manufacturing operations that is required to put together this really intricate, really sort of impressively compact device. And then I looked at sort of the whole array of technologies that are behind the screen that we don't tend to think about so much, and hopefully providing a full soup-to-nuts portrait of how this device works and where it comes from.
It's an amazing story, and you visited every inhabited continent, took 8,000 photos, 200 hours of interviews, went through three different iPhones, including a black market iPhone we'll talk about. Now, you can't even open this device generally. It's you're not supposed to. And we'll talk about the labor conditions and things like that. Did you come away with a feeling that Apple is morally or ethically compromised any worse than all the consumer electronic firms that are, getting their stuff from other parts of the world? And personally, are you anti-Apple, agnostic, pro-Apple? Where do you stand?
Actually, Apple is probably one of the better actors in the industry, if only marginally so. So I'm certainly not anti-Apple. Mm-hmm. What I was trying to do is use the iPhone, this ubiquitous sort of product, as sort of a stand-in, as sort of like a portal to look at how these sort of supply chains work and sort of how, these are functioning on, as you said, every different continent. And the reality is, whether or not you're making an iPhone or, a big screen TV or, a laptop, a lot of the stuff behind these gadgets, is mined in unsavory, sometimes downright deadly conditions, and it on the laborers. And Apple's not worse than its competitors, but it is also perhaps the most influential, most powerful company in the space, so it has more influence and perhaps more capacity to, enact changes to its supply chain. So it's a little bit of a push and a pull. I wouldn't say I'm anti-Apple. I would say that I think I'd encourage everybody to really kind of look at this element of the object that we use every day and sort of try to integrate that understanding, that reality, into the fact that we use these and we benefit from that labor every day. So what do we do with that? Maybe we push Apple to be a little bit more proactive on some of its standards. Maybe we ask it to do more thorough audits and that sort of thing. But it's it's not Apple who's the bad actor. It's the way that the sort of the industry is currently sort of structured.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. You talk about there's been a billion of these phones sold. It's maybe one of the most profitable devices, 40 to 70%, I think you say. Do you think that, A, this is the biggest consumer product in history, and B, why do you think the phone companies, and you even say IBM had a smartphone Simon communicator in 1992, why do you think that they didn't get to deliver this and it came from an outside consumer company, computer company?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. There are a lot of counts that, while some Wall Street firms have tried to sort of break down the device and look at the different costs involved with making it. And Apple doesn't release a lot of information, so it's hard to say exactly what its profit margins are. But a lot of reports kind of show that they are pretty staggeringly high, and as you said, anywhere between 40-45% to upwards of 60%, depending on how you factor in the R&D costs and all of that. It is really interesting that it was ultimately Apple that sort of stumbled onto this magic formula. In a sense, IBM, as you said, and a number of other technology companies in the early 90s basically sort of wrote out the ingredient list. So if I'm describing the IBM Simon in a vacuum to somebody who hasn't heard of the iPhone or the IBM Simon either, and I'm saying, okay, you've got this black rectangular device. It's got a touch screen. It's got apps that you touch the screen to open them up. You can get more apps. It makes calls. It has email. It can connect to the internet. It sounds an awful lot like an iPhone. The problem is that the technology just wasn't there yet in order to make it function and behave and sort of seem like an iPhone. And that's the important thing that Apple really nailed, is it added this sort of signature user interface that's really just kind of a delight to use.
Mm-hmm.
That you swipe and you're pinching and zooming. And they really were able to harness sort of the evolved processor, which had, reached a sweet spot, as one of the Apple engineers told me. The computer chips had just, developed to a place where, around that time, they had gotten small enough and low power enough that they could slide into a phone-sized device and provide enough sort of horsepower, enough enough juice for the computer to work like it actually is. It's an iPhone. It's called an iPhone, but it is actually a mobile computer. So you kind of had to wait to get these different things intersecting. A fast enough computer, a wireless network that was good enough to transmit data so people could make use of the online apps, and the industrial design had to be there, which is a big part with Johnny Ive and his, famous team of designers were able to make it look really cool. So they benefited from this sort of these intersectionalities that Apple's really brilliant software designers and industrial designers and engineers were able to seize on and create this great product.
All right, last couple of minutes here. What did you find to be the biggest surprise in your mind? Now, I know you make a point in the book that this is sort of a convergence of technologies more than an invention of technologies. And what surprised you the most? And does Steve Jobs come away with a different take as sort of a one-man cult figure?
It's not even necessarily Steve Jobs' fault that we kind of perceive him this way, but he, I don't think that he'd have any problem with it. But he certainly is a suitable figure for that sort of lone inventor myth that we just kind of tend to perpetuate, whether we really want to or not. The myth of Edison, working in his lab alone and getting the, filament right for his light bulb, and aha, there it is, the invention. It's just a really compelling narrative, and really one of the things that surprised me was the extent to which the inverse was actually true, sort of the complex, vast ecosystems of people and ideas that had to be pulled from to make this possible, to the point that, at a number of junctures in the history of the iPhone within Apple, Steve Jobs was actually, outright hesitant or even opposed to the device itself. At one point he said, I'm not so sure about these smartphones. It seems like they might be something for just the pocket protector crowd. Only geeks are going to want smartphones. And his executive staff kind of talked him into it. And at other points, he didn't want to do, he didn't want to get into the phone market for fear of, mixing up with the telecoms, which were kind of had controlled a lot of what handset manufacturers could make. So he did. There were all these hurdles and places where he doubted the viability of the ultimate product. But he, to his credit, on the other hand, he did, listen to the right people. He grabbed the right ideas. He made a few of the key decisions at the key times. So, maybe when I went into this, I was actually more skeptical of his role than when I came out of it.
Interesting. You listen to Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. Go to biztalkradio.com, find the station closest to you, or listen over the Internet. Access our archive of podcasts. In the next segment, we'll go inside the guts of the iPhone. And we're back. Our guest, tech journalist, iPhone expert now, Brian Merchant. We're going to sort of take the cover off a little bit and look under the hood here. And by the way, how did you get the hood off anyway? And underneath, what does it look like in terms of, I know you said the battery takes up 50%. Give us just an overview of what it looks under the skin first.
Apple really doesn't want consumers sort of taking the screen off ourselves. So what they've done is they have used sort of these proprietary screws called pentalobes that are, it's a specific shape and they're very small, and you need a sort of a custom screwdriver to even use to get them off in the first place. So you have to go out and buy basically a specific tool set if you want to, check out this product that you bought yourself. And something that Apple's done for a long time, they don't like to have sort of modularity at all. They don't like they don't like to give people the opportunity to sort of hack the devices. And that is another thing that comes from sort of Steve Jobs' mindset. He never wanted people to sort of tamper with his stuff that he designed because it was supposed to work and look and feel a certain way. Again, has pros and cons, and some people really like that approach, and some people push back against it. But so it is with the iPhone. Not being at the time any proficient gadget repair technician or anything, I decided to turn to some of the experts in the field, these guys from a great company called iFixit, who sort of their bread and butter is publishing these guides to tearing down gadgets and repairing them. They're all about trying to educate people to get them to know how to fix these things up themselves. 9 times out of 10, if your phone's not working right, if it's slow or sluggish, it could be something as simple as just your battery's running out of juice. So you can swap out the battery. You can get a battery, for just $30 or something, slide it back in, and it will work like new sometimes. So they're all about that sort of transparency and that sort of educational side. So they have a headquarters in San Luis Obispo in California. And I went to their HQ, and they sort of walked me through it. And it was this really interesting experience of taking the thing off for the first time. If you're not a gadget geek and you don't sort of know what all these components are, it can be a little, surprising that the so much sort of compact circuitry and so much technology is crammed into this slender profile. As you said, 50% about of the space is the lithium-ion battery. They've really tried to squeeze everything else down around it, but battery technology is one of those stubborn things that they haven't really found out a way to condense much more than they have already. So you have other things like digitizer cables that sort of, sweep across and down the side, and they connect to the screen so you can sense finger movements. You have sort of a double-sided motherboard that sort of lodges a lot of the chips. There's a bunch of different microchips that do a number of different functionalities. The biggest of which is the ARM processor, which is another story in the book about how that came to be. It's a special kind of chip architecture that is now more widely used than Intel, which is Intel still perhaps has more name recognition because it's It's an American company with a mythology and history that's closely bound up with Silicon Valley. But ARM is now sort of the biggest game in town, and it's one of the things that makes the phone possible too.
Interesting. Let's talk now about Foxconn, the factory where these things are produced, because you were the first person, I think, to sneak in, certainly the first journalist.
It has an entire sort of geography of as a city would. You have sort of like the docks, and people actually that we interviewed called it the docks on the outside, where people were working on more sort of manual labor, sort of more. It was a little less regulated, and as you moved into the center, there's sort of gentrified like a city would. You have things like a 7-Eleven. There's a 7-Eleven that only Foxconn factory workers ever see or go into, and there's cyber cafes and all that. But of course, it's organized around these giant sort of cell block looking buildings that are really just towering structures that house these assembly lines of hundreds and hundreds of people. You know, your iPhone kind of feels like this sleek, sealed together, this artifact, this gadget, this kind of almost this cutting edge thing. But of course, it's made by hand. It's put together by this really intricate, really sprawling assembly line where you have workers who are doing kind of the same repetitive function day in, day out for 10, 12 hours a day, kind of, soldering on a tiny little component or just wiping the glass clean and then on to the next station. And the sum total impact of this kind of nature of work, combined with the fact that there's a really aggressive management style where if you mess up, you are liable to be yelled at publicly. Your supervisor can have you stand up, and at the end of the day, they'll say, "This is why we didn't make quota. It's Yu's fault. You really let everyone down, and you'll have to publicly apologize." And for a lot of people who have moved from perhaps more rural parts of the country to work in this crazy sort of high stress, very mind-numbing environment, it causes some psychological distress. It can be very problematic. So that is what we kept hearing when we would interview the workers who are on the ground there, that there's just this ghost of death there as a result. It's been normalized. You just expect.
You also went into the Bolivian mines for looking at where they get mined tin and gold, where they use child laborers, and that just the picture there was scary. Quickly, as we go down, in the black market, you said that they can reverse engineer and build one of these things in 30 minutes for $50.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting that just a few miles away from that manufacturing plant that I was just describing, there is sort of the aftermarket for these things, for phone parts, and any number of things can happen to your iPhone when you're done with it. But one of the things that usually happens is it ends up in waste fill, or if you're more proactive, you drop it off to a recycler, and these streams often end up back to China, where people will buy up these parts. And I tracked down this black market inside the city of Shenzhen, again, just miles away from where they're made, where you have bits and pieces of iPhones. You'll have a stall selling all camera parts or all batteries or just the motherboard. So I just thought it would be a fun experiment to ask one of the vendors there how much I could, how far we could drill down, and could he just kind of build me an iPhone from scratch? And he said, sure. I gave him $50. I got the sense he would have done it for less, and he just went from stall to stall, picked out a battery, picked out a camera, picked out a motherboard, picked out a casing, brought it back to his work desk, and just screwed it together for me right before my eyes.
And we'll look at Apple's Manhattan Project next. We're back with Brian Merchant, The One Device, The Secret History of the iPhone. That's his new book that's just out, and I'm calling it a Manhattan Project, but it said that the actual development of this broke the rules of product management in every single way. Talk about the product management process.
So it was really kind of a really interesting model, and as that employee did tell me it did break a lot of the rules, or sort of the conventions, at least, of how these things are usually done. And that's in part because it came together so organically, and it began, with this sort of investigation into sort of user interface and what the future of that was going to look like. And once the decision was made to do a phone and to use this sort of advanced touchscreen, multi-touch-based technology as the centerpiece, then you had some of the software engineers sort of coming over to their neck of the woods to work very closely and to collaborate. And so it began with once it was an official project, once Steve Jobs was sold on the idea of doing a phone, which took some, serious convincing to get him there. But once he did, it really did become this top secret thing within Apple, where there was one sort of building in the Cupertino headquarters, the 2 Infinite Loop, in a floor just above the Industrial Design Studio, that they started really sealing it off. There were badge readers. You could only get in if you, were disclosed on this particular project. And you would have the managers who Jobs only allowed the managers to hire people for this project within Apple, not without, not outside. So, but they could choose anyone that they wanted within the company. So they would come to an engineer's office and they'd sit down and say, listen, there's this top secret project going on. I think you'd be perfect for it. We know you're a star at this company. Unfortunately, I can't tell you anything else about it, but you just have to tell me whether or not you're on board by the end of the day, or we're going to find someone else. Oh, by the way, it will probably mean giving up your weekends, your nights, your holidays. You're just going to have to do nothing but work on this for the next couple of years. And somewhat remarkably, they got a lot of people to say yes. They got a lot of people turn them down too, but they headed over to what would soon be called the Purple Dorm, because the iPhone's code name was the Purple Project. It was, in those quarters, this really intensive, round-the-clock effort to mix this brand-new multi-touch sort of input system to sort of Apple's classic software design. It's very friendly, user-focused, intuitive design. So these guys were just kind of bouncing ideas back and forth, coming up with design flourishes, shooting other ones down, figuring out, a lot of these mechanisms that had to be built for the first time, like slide to unlock or a way to turn on your phone if it's all screen, right? You need to figure out these brand new sort of solutions to problems that hadn't even existed yet.
Now, there's politics involved here, kind of teams somewhat pitched against each other. And if I look at it, there was kind of one approach was to sort of upscale the iPod into a phone, and the other was sort of to downscale the Mac computer in down into a phone. Is that about right?
Yeah, no, that is right. And that sort of arose because at the time, in 2004, 2005, the iPod had really taken off, and it was the hit product. It was maybe at its peak around then. I think 2005, the iPod was even maybe half of Apple's entire revenue. So it was something that the company had a keen interest in sort of protecting and sustaining. So one of the reasons they actually decided to do the iPhone, one of the key sort of prongs of the argument that eventually swayed Jobs, was that cell phones were getting smarter and they were going to be able to hold MP3s. So pretty soon people were going to be ditching their iPods because they didn't want to, have 2 devices in their pockets if they could just carry the one. So in order to sort of protect their market share, they started exploring fast ways to get, a phone to the market. So, and one of the first things that seemed really obvious was to take this design and this product that had already proven a smash success, the iPod, and see if you could just graft a phone onto it. If you can just get it to make phone calls, then you have, you've got the brand recognition, it's already phone sized, it's already sort of, you don't have to do a whole lot of legwork in launching a whole brand new product line. Unfortunately, it's just really, there's no good way to make a phone call from a rotary dial wheel. Yeah, you remember that iPod used to have that click wheel. So for a while Jobs was like, okay, Tony Fadell, who ran the iPod team, he said, if you guys can get this, iPod phone to work, then we'll run with this. But meanwhile, on the software side, you had the other guys squeezing down, as you said, sort of a Mac operating system based architecture onto the phone too, because if they could get that to work, which there was no guarantee that they could do that either, because they were just basically taking the contents of an entire laptop or desktop computer and trying to squeeze it down into something that would fit in a phone. And they were even smaller than they are now. The first round of iPhones, the first model was much smaller. So it did become sort of this competition, and their politics did get involved, especially between sort of the managers of the project. Scott Forstall was the chief of the software effort, and Tony Fadell was the head of the iPod phone, and then the hardware effort. So there was this sense of each team wanted to get their product to market.
Now, Jobs' management style, this obsessive secrecy, not really empowering people, was that a negative impact on the project, or just his intensity spurred everything? I
think it's another instance of being a double-edged sword, where it's hard to argue that it wasn't effective when it ended up at least playing some role in producing the most successful consumer product of recent memory. But it is, there's a lot of people who are aggrieved by it, who felt that it wasn't necessary, that people could have worked together even better had there been more transparency. It did serve to kind of deteriorate morale in quarters of the company that weren't involved in it. As the project ramped up, it became very clear that there was something special going on that they weren't a part of. So a lot of people just kind of, felt bad about that. And meanwhile, people who even were working on the hardware couldn't see what the software guys were doing because it was so secretive. And that caused some resentment for sure, because they're like, okay, well, we're working on this thing too. We need to know what it's going to look like in order to, do some of this hardware design and make sure we've got the right stuff. But Steve Jobs was so paranoid about that user interface, which he would later call magical, that multi-touch and the pinch to zoom and all that he was just worried that if that got out, they would, the jig would be up. This is such glamour stuff that this building, being able to be on the team to build this, but the human toll you talk about is pretty unbelievable. I think it's 36 deaths of folks that worked, and that includes Jobs, obviously, divorce, health. What about the human toll? That was a really remarkable element, too, and that people who were there, engineers, and especially the engineers who were sort of tasked with making this thing happen, right? A lot of the software designers and the human interface designers were like, that it was just our job, but they would have to come up with the ideas, and then you had this whole cadre of engineers who was kind of like do or die. You have to make it happen or face Jobs' wrath. And a lot of them said, that was the most miserable time in my life, but I wouldn't change it, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. Like, we did it. I got, some of them frankly told me, the iPhone is the reason that I'm divorced. It's that simple. It consumed my life to such an extent, and I let it consume my life to such an extent that, it ruined my personal relationships with the people that I was closest to. It is a powerful thing, and it is something to recognize, as another one of those inputs, as another toll of the device. Now, as we finish up under a minute in this segment, you list the folks in these various groups, the design group, the hardware groups, Siri, whatever, and no one really ever heard of these guys before, other than Johnny Ives. Was that because of Steve, or did it feel good that you've sort of released their anonymity? Yeah. No, these guys deserve just as much credit, some of them maybe even more, as those two folks, guys like Bas Ording, Imran Chowdhury, Greg Christie. These designers, Josh Strickon and Brian Huppy, the input engineers early on, these guys really sort of, from the earliest stages, cobbled together the idea and realized that they're some of the unsung heroes in technology of the last 25 years.
Our final national segment coming up will look towards the future at Apple. All right, our final segment with Brian Merchant, senior editor of Motherboard. But before we get into sort of the finale here, do you have any inkling of the phone that's about to come out, which I've heard might be called X or 8? There's rumors of delays now, problems with the fingerprint recognition. Do you have a sense of what's happening there?
Whenever a new phone sort of approaches this point in its release cycle, you're going to get a lot of rumors and a lot of sort of he said, she said about what's actually going to be in the device. I think at this point it's safe to assume that indeed there's going to be a really slick looking screen, OLED screen that does sort of bend around the edges and gets rid of even more of the bezel. It's probably going to be a really slick looking device. And there's been some pretty credible reports that they had a lot of trouble getting the fingerprint sensor to work on that screen, because one of the things that they're doing is they're going to finally get rid of the home button. Again, this is all speculation and all rumor sourced on supply chain stuff, but they were going to get rid of the button and turn it into
Why is it important to get rid of the button? I mean, is there any logic for that?
No, I don't think it's important. I think it's just, Apple is constantly striving to improve simplicity, to streamline, they're one of the great minimalist product designers. So if there's no button, that's one less thing. It's just even more slick looking than before.
Any improvement in the battery life you think coming?
I would doubt it. Maybe marginal.
Yeah. See, those are the things that really matter, because the batteries burn through so quickly. They're going to open a data center in China, linked to a government-owned company. Is that scary news?
It's not that scary. I think it's just another continuation of the trajectory that we've been on. China is a big X factor for Apple. It's a huge prospective market that they, really have not been as people would say they haven't been aggressive enough in trying to win it. So they're doing a number of things, perhaps to curry favor, perhaps to make sure that its relationships with the government remain good. So they lost a lot of their market share there to sort of knockoff phones. There's a lot of regional smartphone makers that we've never heard of, that people are using instead of iPhones. It's still like this top tier status symbol in China. Most people don't have iPhones.
Do you think that now we have an addictive product? It's a fashion device, right, as opposed to a commodity. Do you think that at some point commoditization is inevitable? And historically, Apple's shrunk down to like 2 or 3% market share in the computer side of their business, the Mac or whatever, to be able to keep their pricing profitability umbrella. How do you see that unfolding?
Yeah, no, I think that's underway already. I think here in the U.S. it is already starting to become a little bit more of a commodity than as you said, a fashion object. It's something that is become kind of standardized. It's really not that exciting for most people. You've got a black rectangle that looks a little bit different than last year's black rectangle. It's becoming sort of just a shape. I kind of liken it to what happened with maybe even the automobile, where like the shape, the sedan isn't an exciting concept anymore, but you can still have cool variations and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But it is sort of going to be interesting to see what what handset makers start to do to sort of try to get their phones to stand out, because we do have this really homogenous market now.
Tim Cook, do you think he is the right man? And in the book, you kind of imply, or that you uncovered, sometimes he opens his email with some sort of a Windows device, right?
yeah. That was kind of a funny aside that I included there. Yeah, I was using an email tracker to see if they were actually logging my responses at all, and it turns out they were opening all my emails. They just weren't getting back to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, Tim Cook, I think all 3 times that I emailed him, either him or whoever his email gets forwarded to was opening up on a Windows machine. So do with that information what you will, but it is a funny.
It's kind of scandalous, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think so? Did you think that Apple is going to continue to need revolutionary products? And is the next one, is it going to be in the driverless space?
Yeah, kind of part and parcel with what I was saying earlier about sort of the iPhone becoming sort of a sedan-like rote product that is kind of at the center of our daily routines, but isn't that exciting. I wouldn't be surprised to kind of see just that become the case with Apple. With it has done very well under Tim Cook by maximizing sort of its revenue streams and by sort of getting the operation side really sort of maximized. And I don't think it needs another innovation necessarily. That's just kind of a thing that's in vogue to say, because it would be exciting, and people who love Apple would love them to come out with a great new revolutionary product. But they're the biggest, most profitable, most valuable company going right now. So
interesting. So you think if they,
right.
for instance, capitalize to the full extent on the Apple Store and consolidating content and all that stuff, that they might not have to reinvent anything else?
Well, eventually they probably will. But people always ask me like, well, what's next? What's the great next thing? And my answer is kind of boring. It's like, in 10 years, I wouldn't be surprised if we have a black rectangle of some variation in our pocket, and it's a good chance that it's going to be Apple that's still running it and reaping the most profits off it.
That is interesting. Do you think that Siri will get into AI or even emotional EQ, emotional intelligence stuff? How far are they going to be able to take that out?
Yeah, I spoke with Tom Gruber, who's one of the architects of Siri, and he's still working on it at Apple, and that was the aim from the very beginning, was to try to get it to be more emotional, more personable, funnier, more interactive, more conversational. So it's right now they've kind of pivoted to doing more of the deep learning stuff that's in vogue, just sort of harvesting or tapping vast pools of data to try to do what, like, say, Google is doing with neural nets and so forth. We could see more of that. Like, Amazon clearly found a great use case for that with the Alexa. I remain a little bit skeptical to see how deeply we actually want this integrated into our daily lives when we're sitting at the office or walking down the street. Is voice command sort of the best interaction tool? Like, I don't know. Certainly there's going to be more. We'll see some interesting stuff.
All right, last question, just like a one-word answer. Life after Steve Jobs. Are Apple's best days ahead or behind?
Depends on how you...
No, ahead or behind?
I'd say ahead.
Good, interesting. Thanks to Brian Merchant. The book, The One Device, The Secret History of the iPhone, and it is a fascinating literal excavation, as I said. Thanks to Brian for giving us a full hour. Thanks to our national audience for listening, and we'll see everybody next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.